So for today's session, I thought we'd talk a little bit about dispelling some of yoga's myths. So I'm keen to hear your ideas, but first I've prepared some thoughts in advance. And then I'd love to hear your ideas, maybe some myths you've already challenged and investigated, and of course your questions. If you have thoughts arise while I'm sharing my little bit, maybe note them down so you don't forget, because I'm really keen to hear about what comes up for you in this talk. And to start,
Mhm.
I want to clarify that I'm going to be talking about what we might call modern postural yoga here, because that's what I've studied and that's what I can speak to. The yoga world is immense, so we can't talk about every point in yoga's history or every yoga form. But for what we know today in the West as yoga, what we'll call modern postural yoga, that's what I'll be addressing. And that kind of leads to the first myth, that there's some pure form of yoga, an original form, that there was once a yoga that was understood by everyone to be the real yoga. And for us Westerners, that this real yoga had sun salutations and reverse warrior and wild thing as prominent aspects of the practice. And that's just not true. So this is the yoga myth I want to share for today, that all yoga postures are ancient. And when I first started studying yoga, I was under the impression that all yoga postures are 5,000 years old, that they're sacred and have been practiced forever. And the reality is that most of the poses that we practice now date back about 100 years in our yoga style to Kuvalayananda and Krishnamacharya and Mysore, India. Of course, some asanas have been practiced for much, much longer. But for example, styles like the primary series of Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga dates back to about the 1920s. So what were the earliest poses? Mainly meditation postures. For the earliest yogis, asana was not a primary focus of yoga. They weren't concerned with healthy bodies and good posture and being able to align their trikonasana. They were all about transcending the physical body, disengaging from any attachment to the body and its needs and desires and the cycle of birth and death. In the Yoga Sutras, which we study on course, this is a dualistic text, which sees the self as composed of both a body or prakriti and consciousness or purusha. And the only asana described is the posture of sitting in meditation to follow the 8 limbs towards samadhi, the absorbed state or the superconscious state. So in a text like the Yoga Sutras, asana literally refers to seat here. With the development of things like Tantra yoga, this idea of the body as part of our experience, a non-dualist approach to yoga began to be more popular. By this, I mean, instead of looking at the self in this dualistic way, there's a body and there's a consciousness. Tantra looked at body, mind, and consciousness as all manifestations of the self or the sacred or the divine. And this kind of led to movement and breath work and kriya, cleansing actions, and mudra, gestures, and ultimately to hatha yoga. Like what's described in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, this is a text written in the 1300s, which described 15 postures. So asanas that you might be familiar with, like hero and cow face and fish and tortoise and Paschimottanasana and Shavasana. The primary postures were seated postures for meditation. There weren't things like sun salutations and chaturangas and inversions, at least not available in writing at this point. And things started to change a lot in the late 1800s, where yoga started to really develop both as a spiritual practice in the West and as a physical practice, part of a physical culture in India. So first there were teachers like Vivekananda, who brought yoga to the US, but at least originally was a lot more focused on like breath work and meditation, wasn't big on asana. And this is a time with Vivekananda where traditional yoga philosophy was really influenced by New Age ideas, Western spiritualism. Then we come to one of the most influential periods of development for modern postural yoga. And this is the period from the turn of the century to about the 1950s in India. First with teachers like Kuvalyananda and Krishnamacharya, and then their students like BKS Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois. I should say I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I've read, this was at a time where there was a huge focus on physical culture, building strong, purified bodies. And perhaps this was in part in response to colonization and wanting to reclaim first their bodies and then their country. And perhaps in some cases, training fighters to rise up and expel the British from India. So Krishnamacharya took this physical culture-focused yoga to a place called Mysore, to the Mysore Palace. And he was in charge of training the young boys, keeping them healthy and fit and disciplined. And this is the advent of the Ashtanga Vinyasa system that we know. Krishnamacharya then trained three major teachers who played a huge role in modern postural yoga. That's BKS Iyengar. So he's known for creating the Iyengar yoga style, known for kind of strict alignment, use of props, and maybe more of a focus on therapeutic applications of yoga. Then there was Pattabhi Jois, known for the Ashtanga Vinyasa style, a really dynamic, kind of gymnastic, very strong adjustments, and adherence to 6 series of practice, like primary series being the first. And then the third was TKV Desikachar, Krishnamacharya's son, known for Vini Yoga, which is a much more individualized style of yoga with practices tailored to each individual. And in fact, Krishnamacharya, as he evolved as a teacher from those origins of this very strong form of yoga in the Mysore Palace, he evolved over the years into a much more individualized approach as well. So just looking at one teacher, handing down a practice to 3 teachers who all 3 created something quite different and unique from the teachings. Imagine that happening for hundreds and thousands of years, and we have the immense world of yoga, right? It's a bit too much to go into here, but if we look at one system like the primary series of Ashtanga, where does this come from? Well, it seems to have a lot of similarity to a Scandinavian gymnastic system that was really popular at the time called primitive gymnastics. This might be something that you want to Google. And blending that with, traditional yoga asana, military calisthenics, wrestling techniques woven in. And this led not only to the Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga system, but also variations like power yoga, Vinyasa flow, just to name a few. So this is where our system comes from. And I like to imagine that, just like I do now as a yoga teacher, the yogis of the time were borrowing and innovating and evolving movement systems to suit the time and the place and the students. So where my big learning came in this subject was that I was adhering to a system, even though it was hurting my body and it wasn't really suiting my students, but I was sticking with it because I thought it was ancient and sacred. And it was, and yet it wasn't. it was still open to interpretation. It was still open to innovation. And that's probably, for me, been the biggest part of my own progression and evolution as a student and teacher in the last, 10 years, is being able to let go of adherence to one system, knowing that system isn't so ancient and has already been innovated and evolved so much that I can continue to do that in a way that's right for this time and this space and these students. Yeah. So to finish, I just have a little quote from Mark Singleton's excellent book called Yoga Body that I wanted to share with you. The practice of asanas within transnational Anglophone yoga, what I've been calling modern postural yoga, is not the outcome of a direct and unbroken lineage of hatha yoga. While it's going too far to say that modern postural yoga has no relationship to asana practice within the Indian tradition, this relationship is one of radical innovation and experimentation. It is the result of adaptation to new discourses of the body that resulted from India's encounter with modernity. So that comes again from Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body, which I highly recommend. On the subject of this particular myth, some other resources that I recommend are Elliot Goldberg's book, The Path of Modern Yoga, and James Mallinson's book, Roots of Yoga. So that's my little contribution to the discussion. It actually took me a really long time to learn about the origins of the practice that I was basically dedicating my life to. And one of the reasons it took so long is that I didn't question it. I was curious about a lot of things: the nature of the self, the nature of existence, how we're all connected. But for a long time, I didn't extend that curiosity to challenge some of the narratives that my yoga community were committed to. But luckily today we have a lot more ability and a lot more resources, so we can share information and ask questions about what we're doing and if what we're doing is working. And also we can sit together with those unanswerable questions like, what is the self? So that's me. That's my yoga myth that I wanted to share. I'm very excited to hear what yoga myths you're curious about or that you've already investigated. Any questions or thoughts from you all? I hand it over to you.